Put down the donut. Donuts. Hey, everybody. All right. I need some kind of confirmation of my existence, and then we'll get started. On air? SolarCloud says on air, so I'm going to assume that I'm on air. SolarCloud, did you have the name Sora first before OpenAI stole it? Okay. Okay. Still don't see anybody. Oh. Okay, confirmed. Good. I was wondering. Yikes. Okay, so as usual, I'm going to come in hot, do the first question, and then we'll move on. We'll get to the regular intro stuff. Range Wilson, hold on. I thought it was pretty well established by this point that our solar system is the oddball, like fewer than 1 in 1,000 are similar to ours. So we still don't know how normal the solar system is, because we don't have the ability with our telescopes to be able to detect the true nature of other star systems. So think about the first planets that were discovered around main sequence stars. Not the pulsar planets were discovered in the 90s, but the first was PEG 51b. And this was a hot Jupiter. So if you were going, where you've got a star with, where you've got a planet with several times the mass of Jupiter that is going around a star, incredibly close, where it's only taking a few days to complete an orbit. We have nothing like that in the solar system. Is that normal? It turns out, no, that's not normal. It's just that is obvious that this giant planet orbiting really close to its star is yanking its star back and forth with its gravity so much that it's relatively easy for us to detect compared to the other finer, more nuanced approaches that we have today. But we now know of 6,000 confirmed exoplanets, with probably another 10,000 exoplanetary candidates, and yet we have still not found a duplicate of the solar system. We have not found an Earth-sized world orbiting around a sun-like star, and it's not because we don't think that they're out there. It's anticipated that Earth-sized worlds orbiting within the habitable zone of its star is somewhere in the order of maybe 10 to 20% of the star systems out there. There should be a lot that we are familiar with stars in the sky that are going to have Earth-sized worlds orbiting within the habitable zone of them. We just can't detect them. We just don't have the telescopes able to do that yet. And so although there are certain indications, like there are classes of planets that we just don't have in the solar system. And the biggest version of this are the super Earths and the mini Neptunes. So planets that are bigger than the Earth, more massive than the Earth, or planets that are smaller, less massive than Neptune. There are lots and lots of them out there. They're very common, and yet we don't seem to have any here in the solar system. So we don't know if the kind of structure that we have, where you've got the terrestrial planets up close, you've got a certain number of them, then you've got a couple of gas giants, then you've got a bunch of ice giants, if that's normal. We still don't really know. We suspect it's not, but we don't know how different we are. And it's going to take next generations of telescopes to give us that answer. We're going to need things like the Habitable Worlds Observatory. We're going to need the Large Interferometer for Exoplanets. We're going to need better techniques, a better version of Gaia that can do better astrometry, maybe get us to the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, tens of millions of exoplanets discovered before we start to get a real sense of whether or not the solar system is normal. All right. Hey, everybody. Ooh, that was a mistake. Not the saying, hey, everybody. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. So, hey, we did it. So sorry about last week. It was sort of like early in the morning on Monday, and I had a live stream scheduled. And then I realized that it was a holiday weekend in Canada, and everyone was taking the holiday off, and my kids were just hanging out. And so I wanted to spend time with my kids and my wife. And so I was like, I'm just going to not do an episode, a live stream this week, and push it back 1 week. And so we did. And so here I am. And it was the right move. I spent the day outside. We built a bunch of nesting boxes for violet green swallows, and we've set them up, and they've already attracted some interest from swallows. So that was sort of a good day. Although there's a woodpecker is out there, a hairy woodpecker, for those of you who know your West Coast Canadian birds, or I guess North American birds, who was trying to widen the hole, which might be very difficult for it to do. But anyway, so that's what I did. Now, go ahead and put any questions or comments or whatever that you might have into the live chat here on YouTube. If you want it to be seen as a question by me for me to try to answer during the live stream, give it a question mark, or use how, who, what, where, when, why, how, and that will trigger the filter that I have that will put it into the filtered list of the questions. A few ground rules. Keep in mind that I'm a journalist, not a scientist. And so if you want my opinion about various scientific topics, I cannot give them to you. I can only give you the sort of scientific consensus about any subject matter, which is good. I think you should want that. You don't want my opinions. My opinions are worthless. They're meaningless. I try to give emphasis to the people who've never had a question answered before, and I can see the number of times that I have answered your question. But, don't let that stop you from putting in questions. Just that if you've never asked a question, or if you're feeling on the fence, this is the time. Go ahead and put in a question. And then the last thing is, we get a lot of the same questions. Sometimes I don't know the answers to questions. So don't take it personally if I don't answer your question. We get about 3 times as many questions during the show as I have time to answer. So just keep that in mind. It's not personal. There's some good reason why I haven't gotten to your question, and it's known only to me. Anyway, all right, let's go ahead and get in with the questions. Okay. Ooh, good question. Wendell Broadwell, could it be that in the far distant future, the whole universe could be absorbed into one colossal black hole? Would Hawking radiation prevent that from happening? So, no, but it's a very interesting question to kind of think about what the future of the universe looks like. So right now we live in this time where we can perceive other galaxies around us, that we can look back to the cosmic microwave background radiation, that this is something that will only be possible for about the first 100 billion years in the history of the universe. When we look at all those other galaxies, we can see that the vast majority of them, apart from like 2, are speeding away from us. And they're just getting farther and farther. And in fact, thanks to dark energy, the speed that they are moving away from us is increasing. And so they will eventually be so far away from us that they will fall over the cosmological horizon, that we will no longer see them sort of speeding away from us, that essentially they will fade away into the sort of background of the universe, that even with giant radio telescopes, we won't be able to detect their red-shifted information, that some future civilization 100 trillion years from now won't see any evidence that there were ever other galaxies in the universe beyond the one that they're within. So this idea of all of the universe coming together into one big black hole is impossible, because all of these galaxies are being carried away from each other. So let's just focus in on the local group, which is our galaxy, Andromeda, M33, the Triangulum galaxy, as well as the several hundred dwarf galaxies that are orbiting around in this big constellation around our galaxy. They will interact with each other, and some percentage of them will merge. Some other percentage of them will be kicked out in 3-body interactions and thrown away from outside of the gravity well of this combined thing. So eventually there will be this line where some of the stuff is bound by the mutual gravity, and some of the stuff has been kicked out, and you'll end up with this galaxy, some future giant elliptical galaxy version of the local group. And you can see examples of what giant elliptical galaxies look like. You can see M87, which is where M87 contains a supermassive black hole, which was one of the ones that was captured by the Event Horizon telescope. So it's a very big galaxy with a very massive supermassive black hole, one of the biggest that we can see in the sky. That's kind of what we will look like. And so, yeah, we will get a much more massive supermassive black hole at the heart when the one at the heart of Andromeda meets the Milky Way, and the one, actually, it's thought that maybe M33 doesn't have a supermassive black hole, but there's going to be some other black holes. They'll all come together and merge into this single black hole. There are also about 100 million stellar mass black holes located in the Milky Way. Probably many times that number in Andromeda, probably the same number over in M33, plus all the black holes that are in all of these dwarf galaxies. So they will all join this community. Some will fall and sink down and be absorbed into the big black hole at the center of this new galaxy. Others will be kicked out through three-body interactions. And then, over very long, deep time, one by one, the stars will be kicked out of this galaxy. That you will have two stars come together. They'll meet a third star. There'll be a three-body interaction. Stars will be kicked into escape trajectories, and they will leave this galaxy, and then they will be part of this acceleration of space, and they will fall over the cosmic horizon one by one. And eventually, you'll just be left with the supermassive black hole at the heart of the giant elliptical galaxy that was once all of these separate galaxies and all of these separate dwarf galaxies. And there will be no more material to fall into that black hole. There will be the cosmic microwave background radiation will be incredibly cold, and then that supermassive black hole will start to evaporate because of Hawking radiation. And after about 10 to the power of 100 years, a Google years, one followed by 100 zeros, that galaxy, after a Google years, that supermassive black hole will have evaporated. And this will be the same process that's going to happen for every other galaxy group out there in the cosmos. Some will be much, much bigger. The ones at a ton 618, or the Phoenix cluster. You've got supermassive black holes that will have maybe 10 billion solar masses. In other cases, you're going to have dwarf galaxies, single dwarf galaxies, where maybe there's only a 10 million supermassive black hole. But that process is going to happen in each one of them. And so no, everything isn't going to combine into one black hole, but every local group is going to combine into their own black hole, kick out all the stars, and then the black holes are going to evaporate. Jack Seabranch, could you interview Konstantin Batygin now that Vera Rubin is operational? It would be very interesting to hear his thoughts. Yeah, it would be great. Sure, I will see what I can do. I've interviewed Mike Brown several times. I've interviewed Konstantin Batygin once. I'll reach out and see hear his plans for trying to find Planet 9. That'd be great. Christian Desalier. I watched Flat Earthers take on the Artemis takeoff and landing. Their misunderstanding of basic science is mind-boggling. What could convince them that the Earth is a blight spheroid? I kind of just take... I don't understand the point of trying. Nothing will convince them. Being on a rocket, leaving Earth, watching the Earth behind them would not convince them. They'd think it was some kind of virtual reality, whatever. When you look at the flat Earth community, and there's some people doing some amazing jobs of debunking this community. I really enjoy Professor Dave Explains. I should do a collaboration with him at some point. And he just does just a merciless takedown of flat Earthers. There's some group of them are grifters, right? Some group of them know that the Earth is round, they believe it, but they're trapped by their audience to be conspiracy theorists. And you see this across a lot of things. I don't know if you watched that new documentary about the manosphere by Louis Theroux. It was great. And it sort of, for me as a YouTuber, I was able to sort of see this perspective of people who say awful things because it pays them very well, and yet they're kind of like clearly egged on by their community further and further. And I think that there's like a lot of people that are in this flat earth community that no longer believe that the earth is flat, that maybe they never did. But they are sort of in this cul-de-sac. They've been pushed into this cul-de-sac by their community. It pays the bills, and so they have to do what they do to keep the money going. That's definitely some certain group of that. And then of course you've got this larger group, maybe smaller group, I don't know, that does believe. They're true believers. But when you believe something, right? When I think about the beliefs that I have, I want to know the truth. I don't want to, I'll give you we talk about this belief that I have here on the channel all the time, right? That I feel that we are alone in the cosmos. That Earth is the only inhabited world in the cosmos. That if there was other alien civilizations out there, we would see evidence of them. I've defended this position many times from a sort of philosophical perspective, but it is not my preferred answer to the question. My preferred answer to the question is that we are not alone, that alien life is everywhere, that Earth is being regularly visited. When I hear the claims made by the UFO believers, I'm sad because I wish they were right. It's funny because people always, I'm rabbit holing on top of rabbit holings, but I'll get back there at some point. People say, oh, you can't handle the truth, man. When it turns out that you were wrong, you were going to be so sad. No, not at all. The universe that I find myself in, the one that it doesn't appear that there's evidence of intelligent civilizations out there, the one that was promised to me by Star Wars and Star Trek and all of the science fiction that I love, that is the one that I would prefer, right? Not the one that we seem to be in, the one that every time we go looking under rocks on Mars, we don't find any life. That's the one, that's the sad one, right? Every time a UFO turns out to be a balloon, that's the bad universe. That's the bad outcome. That's not the one I want. But I want to know the truth. I want to know what's real. Not what I hope is real, not what I believe is real. I want to know the sort of true nature of things. And I think that most people, that's how they feel too. It feels, because it's like, if you like, and I totally understand that there's like a cognitive dissonance, that there are people who take a stand on something, climate change, political beliefs, religious beliefs, whatever. And when the evidence starts to build that your perspective is wrong, you double down, because the alternative is sort of too horrifying to contemplate. And it's not until like at the very end, when just absolute unequivocal proof has been put in front of you, do you finally sort of change your tune and go back to it. That is, I don't think that a lot of people in the flat earth community are really on that level. I think that there is a sort of deeper distrust and frustration with the status quo, right? That everybody can feel that things seem difficult right now, economically, in terms of power, in terms of the destabilization, the things that are going on, and that the reality appears to be it's because the world is very complicated. Right? That it is always because the world is very complicated, that human beings have complex desires, things they want, power structures, reward certain kinds of behavior, there are corporate interests, that they're, like it's all very complicated. But it is a lot more satisfying to perceive that there is some kind of conspiracy. There's like this really simple, okay, there's just this group and they're in charge and they make us think these things. And once we uncover the truth of what they are and what they're doing, then we'll live in this better place. And so I know I live in this kind of weird disbelief at that people can actually take these ideas seriously. And the level of sort of dodging and, like the level of not delusion, because I don't think delusion is the right word. I have to sort of better articulate my perspective on this, because a lot of people like confront these people and go toe to toe with them. And I sort of watch from afar and go, oh, that's so weird. But I don't think, yeah. And then you think about like, what is the rationalization that they're using to say like, oh, that great big rocket just took off. Where'd it go? Right? Oh, this capsule just landed. Like 1 million people watched the Space Launch System take off, the rocket take off. So like you have to be on board that a giant rocket was built and deployed and launched and it went somewhere, right? Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, I think that the rise and fall of things like flat Earth will just come down to how hard is the YouTube algorithm pushing it at any one time. How much does our social media drive controversy? How much does it, how much are the social media companies profiting off of our division, where it's reinforcing people's belief that in conspiracy theories or whatever. So what would convince them that the Earth is an oblate spheroid? I mean, if you want to have a serious conversation, and if the person who believes in the flat Earth is genuinely interested in the inquiry, then you just watch a total lunar eclipse. Like, that's it. Like, a total lunar eclipse. Actually, there's two that will absolutely give you. The total lunar eclipse is one that, like, why is there a round circle starting to bite out of the moon? The shadow of the Earth is falling on the moon, and the Earth is a sphere. Therefore, you are getting this circular shaped shadow that's falling on the moon. It requires really complicated complications to try and come up with some explanation for that. And then the other one, and this is one that I've experienced personally, is that wherever you live in the world, I live in the northern hemisphere, some of you live in the southern hemisphere, you are familiar with how the moon looks at all its phases. When you just see that little crescent above the horizon, it looks a certain way. And then later on, it becomes a half moon, and then it becomes a full moon, and then sort of goes through the rest of its phases. And so if you then travel to the other hemisphere of the world, the moon is upside down, right? If you go to the exact opposite location, latitude from where I'm at the 49th parallel or 50th parallel in the northern hemisphere, if I go to the southern equivalent of that, the moon is completely upside down. It goes through its phases in the opposite direction. And it's very easy to explain that from a spherical world, that I am standing in one perspective looking at the moon. And then if you're in the southern hemisphere, you're now literally upside down looking at the moon from upside down. And so those two things alone give irrefutable proof that we live on a spherical planet. And you can sort of quickly figure out whether or not the person that you're interacting with, your interlocutor, is being honest or dishonest if they can't have an explanation for the solar, for a lunar eclipse. And they can't. So, yeah. But I know like a lot of people are very annoyed. Again, like Professor Dave explains, he comes in pretty mad and doesn't pull any punches. And I'm sort of still in the curious mode. And I've been doing this job for 27 years. I've been dealing with flat earthers, dealing with UFO people, dealing with people who think Planet X or Nibiru or whatever. Like, I've been dealing with this. I've had death threats about me pushing back about these kinds of things. But I am still just kind of mostly curious. Like, why? Why do you feel this way? What is it? And I find that when you have conversations with people, you can sort of suss out right away whether or not whether it's a grift or whether they are genuinely introspective about these ideas, and that it is a more deeper issue, that they are feeling uneasy, they're feeling harmed, they're feeling concerned and nervous about their future, about their loved ones. And that sort of drives them to seek conspiracies as a simple explanation for what they're going through. And that the flat earth is one example of an easy conspiracy to then, gives a satisfying answer to this very deep, nuanced, complex problem. And so, yeah, I kind of mostly just have curiosity. And I'm not getting enough curiosity to kind of want to talk to them anymore. But I do have I wonder why you feel that way. Anyway, is sort of how I approach it. Jimmy James, Maul, Shadowlord, good or bad? I haven't watched it. I just cut off my Disney Plus. I cut off a bunch of my streaming services, so I'm probably not going to be able to be as up to date on my reviews of television shows for a while. So I have no idea. I did show my color card. I did it before I turned on the live stream. CeeLo 87, if left unchecked, how long would it take the L2 Lagrange point to clear out? Not long at all. The L1, the L2, and the L3, the ones that are lined up, are unstable. And so it actually requires propellant for you to be able to maintain in that position. So you would drift away and be pretty far out of that Lagrange point within a couple of years. So yeah, it is not stable. Unlike the L4, L5. Silas Miller, birds aren't real, Fraser. Well, everybody knows that. Anyone who believes in birds is crazy. Testing. Will the Habitable World Observatory plan to look in many directions, or will it focus on where Kepler looked first? So Habitable Worlds has two priorities once it does finally get built. One is that it's going to find, target, and the first thing is it's going to find candidate habitable worlds, and then it is going to observe them. So one of the big problems that we have right now in the field of exoplanetary research is that we don't know where the Earth-sized worlds orbiting around sun-like stars are. We know of Earth-sized worlds orbiting within the habitable zone of red dwarf stars. We know where there are hot Jupiters, mini Neptunes, super Earths, things like that. But we just don't have the telescopes to be able to find the Earth 2.0, right? And Kepler was the mission that should have been able to do it. But the problem, of course, was that Kepler lost its reaction wheels, and so it was unable to complete its mission in time to be able to find those candidate planets. And so they had to switch to the Kepler 2 project, where they were finding worlds around red dwarf stars, but they weren't able to do that original goal. And that was the Finder telescope that would then have fed in all of these candidate worlds to the other observatories that were going to come after that. We've got the TESS mission right now, but TESS is really not able to find those worlds. And like maybe if we're really lucky, it'll find a couple of Earth-sized worlds orbiting around sun-like stars in the habitable zone, but most likely it won't. We've got the Plato mission that is coming up, and that again probably will be able to find a couple of these other Earths. But really, you want a large collection of them. You want dozens, if not hundreds, of candidate worlds, and then you look at the best candidates carefully to detect the presence of various chemicals in the atmosphere. You study the atmospheres of those other Earths. And so right now we don't have the potential, the targets in the pipeline. And so a lot of the work that's being put into the development of the Habitable Worlds Observatory, as well as the Large Interferometer for Exoplanets, the LIFE mission, is that they have to both be the Finder telescope and the analyzer. So they have to point at a star, a sun-like star, and observe it, block the light from that star, and look for any example of Earth-sized worlds, planets within the habitable zone of that star. And if they find, after a certain amount of observation time, if they find it, then that gets added as a candidate. They move on to the next star, that gets added as a candidate. Then they'll have this big list. And then astronomers will argue over the list, and then they'll go to what is the best candidate in that list, and they'll start making those observations. And so unfortunately, there are just not the telescopes in the pipeline right now to get us those candidate worlds. There's a lot of ideas. The Nancy Grace Roman is gonna have the ability to find Jupiter-sized worlds orbiting around sun-like stars, but not Earth-sized worlds. So unfortunately, right now, right now, the plan for all of these next generation big telescopes is search stars for planets, then analyze those planets to see if there's life there. SM Colons, is anyone setting up a public access list of new finds of Vera Rubin? I know some let you sift through things, but more of an astronomy picture of the day kind of review. That's an interesting question. So, I've been interviewing people from I interviewed one of the data brokers, the Antares group that is part of the Noir Lab. And they're one of the data brokers. They're essentially taking the full feed from Vera Rubin, and then they're filtering out for the kinds of events that their astronomical community is interested in. There's another one that's working on solar system objects, and there's like 9 data brokers. And all of their APIs are publicly available. And so you can go and use any one of these APIs, and you can make things with it. And I've been suggesting that people, programmers, and even non-programmers, now that we've got these tools like Claude and Codex from ChatGPT, you can actually make a tool that interfaces with the Vera Rubin data and turns up some kind of information. And, some of the systems that people have built are really cool. People have shown me a lot of really cool ideas that they've built so far. I should really start gathering them together and kind of presenting them on a regular basis and giving links so they can get more publicity. But these things are out there for sure. Really cool visualizations of using the Vera Rubin data. So, there hasn't, none have sort of climbed all the way to the top, and they're very, I guess none have become very widely known yet because it's still a fairly niche thing. But I should definitely do a better job of helping to promote. So this is my open call to you. If you have built something that uses the Vera Rubin data that is a really cool visualization so people can look at it, like maybe astronomy picture of the day, or maybe something more useful for people who want to do follow-on observations, discover asteroids, comets, variable star observing, supernova, things like that, let me know, and I will try to promote what you're doing here on my channel. conspiracy theory enthusiast. What was your favorite part of the Artemis 2 mission? Oh man. I mentioned this in a couple of videos that I was so entranced by the Artemis 2 mission. I had a really good time watching every part of this, from the initial launch through the ongoing operations, watched the lunar flyby, watched interviews. The Canadian Prime Minister interviewed the Canadian astronaut. That was cool. So let me see. I would say that the part that struck me the most, one was just the images of the moon blocking the sun, where we got this lunar eclipse, or I guess a solar eclipse, because it was unscheduled. That originally the sort of the geometry wouldn't have worked out for them to be able to take that picture. But then because the mission was delayed a month, they were able to, the sun had moved in the sky, and the way things were going to line up, they were able to get that image of the sun going behind the moon. And that allowed them to do some additional science, watching as the sun just went behind the moon. They got some additional science. That was very cool. But I think the part that I enjoyed the most was actually the reentry at the very end. You know, those of us who've been watching the program for years, you know, the heat shield on the Orion capsule is the thing that was the most nerve-wracking. We saw a weird wearing pattern. The way the heat shield had ablated after the previous tests with the Orion capsule was a little nervous making. And so this was the thing, right? This time there were going to be humans on board that this thing had to hold. And so we saw, and it was, you know, coming in from the moon. It was very fast, much faster than the previous reentries. And so everything had to go exactly right. And this was the moment where I was, like, on the one hand, really excited to see the astronauts return. On the other hand, really nervous and scared that something could go wrong. But the coverage was great. You know, we heard the conversations from the crew. They went into that blackout period where we didn't know if they were okay or not. And this is sort of part of the process of re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. And then incredible telescope, I don't know how they, on ships, telescopes on ships, seeing the capsule falling, entering the atmosphere. And then you saw the series of parachutes come out, and then the thing landed, and it was just floating there in the Pacific. Like, that was just really good coverage. Like, clearly NASA has learned a ton from SpaceX on how to present your missions. So I would say that my favorite part was the reentry and the return to Earth and the landing, you know, because they didn't set foot on the moon. Like, obviously some of, you know, when we see the human astronauts land on the moon, hop out of their lander, walk around on the surface of the moon, like, that's going to be great. And those will be the highlights. And then, like, which one? Like, when they played golf or when they drove around their buggy, which was your favorite part? But for now, I think, yeah, the safe landing, the safe return for me was the kind of cathartic ending to that mission. And it was great. Like, it was so great to know that we can do this, that humans can be sent out beyond the moon, that capacity, that capability exists on planet Earth, is just great, and just makes me feel so hopeful that there is this candle of human space exploration that will just never go out, from the space shuttles through the space station through the Artemis program. And, like, maybe it's not ideal and maybe it isn't what we wanted, but it's still, we're seeing this ongoing exploration of the solar system with human beings, and I love it. Afish, why do scientists call a black hole a singularity? We can see neutron stars, and if mass added, so escape velocity is faster than the speed of light. So I mean, astronomers or scientists call a black hole, and then the part of the black hole where all of the mass is concentrated in the black hole, they call that a singularity. And it is we don't know if it is actually a singularity, like a place where the mass goes to infinity at the heart of the black hole. Or let me just again, we don't know if, the actual black hole, whatever the black hole is this infinitely small, essentially singular object with no size, and yet has all of the mass of the entire star that was there before. Like, that's where you get this idea of the singularity, that essentially you've got a mass several times the mass of the sun compressed into an area that is approaching zero, right? And that's how you get this idea of a singularity. We don't know if that's true, that it could be that a black hole is like a neutron star, that it's just a little bit smaller than a neutron star inside the event horizon, that you compress down a neutron star one more level and you end up with an object. It's a black hole. The escape velocity of this object is now exceeding the speed of light, and so you can no longer see it because the light can't escape. But the actual physical nature of that thing, we don't know. And we may never know. The problem is that all the tools that we may have to try to analyze these objects is, they all require you to be able to travel at the speed of light or slower. And since you have to be going faster than the speed of light to be able to theoretically escape a black hole, you can't see them. So it is more of it's that the math, right? The mathematical description of a black hole, that's where the term comes from. But the actual physical reality of what it is, we still don't know and may never know. Melantoria, have you ever been to a LARP game? No. So in a previous life, I was I used to organize role-playing game conventions in Vancouver. So for about 3 years in a row, like I used to go to role-playing game conventions and I used to really enjoy them, but I found they could be done better. And so for 3 years, I organized a convention in Vancouver and then got distracted with other things. And so stopped doing that. And on the third year, somebody wanted to run a LARP game. They ran a live action version of Vampire the Masquerade. And it turned into this sort of community defining event for the role-playing community in Vancouver. And tons and tons of people became really good friends after this event. And so it was like one of the most important community building things. Some of my best friends were part of that. I didn't play because I was too busy running the convention. So I haven't ever been to a LARP game. I have just run the convention that had one that then created some of my entire friend group in Vancouver. B. Bartkey, could you do a segment on Space Bites about the proposed Mercury rover that would follow the Terminator that I read about on Universe 8? We did. That was in this week's Space Bites. Was it in the extra? Let me check. Yeah, no, we covered it in Space Bites this week. So it was the 1, 2, 3, 4. It was the 5th story at the 13:34-minute mark on Space Bites 208. So the most recent Space Bites. Anon Liddy. Explain it to me like I'm 5. Why the observable universe is 93 billion light years across, yet it's actually bigger than that. How wide is it actually? Sure. So here's the explain it to you like you're 5 version. And this is, I'm going to go back to my example of the Fogiverse. So imagine you're standing in fog and you can see about 30 meters away. That right up close to you, you can see your hands. There doesn't seem to be any fog in between your hands. Cars nearby, you can see they're slightly obscured by fog. And then you can see, the very limits of the fog is, say, 30 meters away from you. Very thick fog. And you say, well, like, how big is the world? Well, the world that you can perceive is 30 meters. And yet you hear sounds that sound like they're coming from very far away. So the world has to be bigger than what you can observe in the fog. That's it. There's the explain it to you like you're 5. So, when we look out into space, we're looking back in time. So when we look at the sun, we're seeing the sun as it looked 8 minutes ago. When we look at Andromeda, we're seeing as it looked 2.5 million years ago. When we look at the cosmic microwave background radiation, we're seeing it as it looked 13.8 billion years ago. That the photons that left some place in the universe have been traveling for 13.8 billion years to finally reach your eyes. That is the very limit, because that is the first light that was released into the universe. We are not seeing, when we sort of imagine this sphere of the observable universe around us, you don't want to just think of it like space. You want to think about it in terms of, I am looking back in time. And it's weird because, like, your brain can handle this nearby, and then after a while this starts to lose meaning, right? If I tell you that you're not seeing the sun as it looks right now, you're seeing the sun as it looks 8.5 minutes ago, you're like, okay, I got that, right? No problem, right? So if there's a flare on the sun right now, I have to wait 8 minutes before I can perceive that flare. Great. So imagine, right, that all the stars in the entire universe have a flare at exactly the same moment. They all flare for some reason, some kind of magic reason. They all flare at the precise same time. What will you see? You'll see the sun flare, and then 4.5 years later, you'll see a flare on Proxima Centauri, and then 10 years later, you'll see a flare on, Bernard star. And then 2.5 million years, you'll start to see flares in the stars in Andromeda. You're seeing this kind of propagation of these flares. And so us seeing light in the universe back to the very beginning of the universe, this 13.8 billion years, it's the same thing. We are seeing light that has had time to travel to us. We cannot see farther than 13.8 billion years ago, because that's how the longest light can have been traveling in the universe. But that, when we look at this region of space, and as you said, it's 93 billion light years across, that's sort of the size of the entire observable universe. Those places that we see right at the very edge of what we can see, we're not seeing them as they look today. We're seeing them as they looked 13.8 billion years ago. And so they do look different today. Like, if you could magically transport yourself to that place at the very limit of what you can see, you would see the modern version of that. Not this release of radiation from the very beginning of the universe, but there would be a galaxy there. And you would be able to see the planets and the stars and so on in that galaxy. And then, but when you were at that point, you would now see a new observable universe around you that is 93 billion light years across. And then if you move to the very edge of that observable universe you could see, now you'd be in the middle of a new one. And so then the big question is, how far could you keep doing that? Could you keep jumping to the edge of your observable universe and then look around in this new observable universe and then jump to the edge of the next one, the next one, the next one? That either it's infinite, you could just keep jumping forever, that there is no end to the universe, that it just goes on forever. And the other possibility is that it's finite, that if you kept doing that jump, you would return to your starting point. In the same way that with the fog that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, that if you jump to the very edge of the fog that you can see, you would see a new fogiverse around you, and you would jump to the edge of the new fogiverse. And let's imagine the entire planet was covered by fog. That eventually you would return to your starting point. You'd be like, wait a minute, this fogiverse feels very familiar to me. I'm back home. And yet you were just traveling in one direction. So I hope that helps. I understand that it's like trying to hold all these separate thoughts in your brain simultaneously is tricky, but just give it time. You'll get there. Gadzooks, what kind of snakes might you see when you walk outside? We only have one kind of snake where I live, which are garter snakes. So they are adorable little snakes. They don't get bigger than about a meter long. They're not venomous. One of my friends got bit by a garter snake once just because he was just being a total jerk to the snake. They'll normally just kind of poop on you if you pick them up. But if you're really roughhouse with them, then they'll bite you. They eat frogs, mice, and are totally harmless. I see them all the time. And it's funny because, as a person who grew up in Western Canada on Vancouver Island, I have no concept of to be fearful about walking in long grass or stepping over logs or over rocks or things like that a lot of the world is quite paranoid about. When I was first visiting with my wife, she was living in Louisiana, and we would go out on hikes and do like photography in the forest. And at one point there was some place that I wanted to get to, and there's a bunch of long grass, and I just started to march through the grass. And my wife was like, "What are you doing? Stop. You do not walk in the long grass." And why not? Snakes. We have venomous. We have these kinds of snakes and those kinds of snakes, and a whole bunch of dangerous snakes, rattlesnakes. And I just was oblivious to this. We don't have hidden animals that are going to attack you. We have bears, right? Cougars, nice, safe animals like that, not snakes or venomous spiders, things like that. So yeah, we have, where I live, we have one type of lizard as well. It's called an alligator lizard, and they're great. They're adorable. And then we have an invasive, wall lizard down in the south end of the island. They're slowly kind of making their way up. But yeah, we don't really have any venomous, we don't have any venomous insects. We've got a couple of barely venomous spiders. We have black widows and we have brown recluses, but they have to be, they're not that dangerous. We just have bears. So, you have to decide, is it the sort of large mammal threat that you're worried about? I see bears almost every single day. Like, I'm walking in the forest, I carry bear spray, I can see a black bear. And you know that if you see a black bear with cubs, you are in for a very bad day. And so you just hope, you pray, right? It's no baby black bears, no baby black bears. It'll be adorable to see baby black bears. You don't want to, because then the mom's somewhere around as well. And now you're in trouble. And I've only seen cougars twice in my life. But that's only a West Coast Canadian thing. So once you are in sort of in the interior of Canada, then they have rattlesnakes even in British Columbia. So I would go visit my cousins in Kamloops, which is in the desert in British Columbia, and our mothers would be paranoid about us going for a hike because they thought we would get bit by rattlesnakes. Dougal, do you prefer writing text articles for Universe Today or being in front of a camera? I much prefer doing the stuff in front of the camera. I much prefer podcasts and video and things like that than writing. For the first 15 years of Universe Today, 10 years, I was the only writer. And so I wrote a lot. And then once I started to do more of the podcasting, more of the video, I was still writing because I was writing scripts for my videos. If you go back to the earlier videos that I used to do, they all had scripts. And so I would write the script, usually about 2,000 words or so. And then I would perform the script, right? I would read from a teleprompter and read it out. And now I don't write scripts. So everything I do is off the top of my head, which I much prefer. It feels a lot more natural. When I do Space Bites, there is no script. I've been doing a lot of the research for for the week. I put a bunch of notes in front of me that I want to cover, and then I just go for it and record. And that is much better for the way my brain works. Yeah. So no, I have ended up doing the kind of job that I most enjoy, and other people on the team really enjoy like writing text. And so they write that stuff on Universe Today. I don't write on Universe Today very often at all. Mostly just because I'm running the site, running the company, and doing all of the video stuff that we do. Jimmy James, to be fair, the black bears here are pretty chill. Yeah. It's like the black bear. So the black bears that we have on Vancouver Island are like big dogs. And if they see you, they run. Just every now and then, people have a bad outcome with a black bear. Grizzly bears, we don't have any grizzly bears on Vancouver Island. Well, we will have a few that will swim over every summer and spend a little time on one little part of the island, and they swim back. Grizzly bears will mess you up. Not like they don't want to hunt you, but they're very territorial, and it takes very little for them to destroy you. So grizzly bears are quite terrifying. I'm very glad we don't have them on the island. Yeah, and we don't have any other kinds of bears. Yeah, no polar bears in this part of Canada. I think it's time to do this. Frank Schifrin. They talk about the Fermi paradox. We hardly see planets. How can we see evidence of other life? All right, it's been a while since I've given my defense or my explanation of the Fermi paradox. So let's go for it. So the Fermi paradox, this comes back to Enrico Fermi, who back in the 1950s was in a conversation with a bunch of other scientists talking about UFOs and aliens and the universe and so on. And the story goes that Fermi did a bunch of math on a piece of paper, or maybe in his head, and then said, well, aliens should be everywhere, so where is everybody? And look, I think it's really important to kind of follow the thought process when you think about the where is everybody. Why the Fermi paradox is an enduring mystery. Because I think when most people hear about the Fermi paradox, they're like, it's easy. The answer is the universe is really big and we haven't even looked. So how can we say that the universe, that there's no life out there? This is simple, done, case closed. I solved it. Suck at science. And of course, people have thought of that, right? That your instinctual response to this idea has occurred to people before. And even thinking that through, they still find the Fermi paradox unsettling. So allow me to roll out the sort of the Fermi paradox in its sort of truly most awe-inspiring, maybe horrific version, and we'll see whether or not you sort of feel the same way at the end of this conversation. So the universe is big, right? 93 billion light years across for the observable universe, possibly infinite. The universe is old, 13.8 billion years old. That there are 100 billion stars in the Milky Way. There are probably 100 billion to 2 trillion galaxies in the universe, each of which has some number of hundreds of billions of stars in it. There are countless stars in the universe. When we look at our own solar system, life on Earth formed within just a few 100 million years of the formation of the planet. Literally, as soon as the Earth had cooled down to the point that life could form, life did form. So when you do that math, when you say, and the solar system is not the earliest that life could have formed in the universe. That when you look at the kinds of heavy elements that are in stars and other star systems, that chances are star systems could have formed life in them several billion years before the solar system. That the concentration of metals had already built up to the point that you had carbon and iron and oxygen and nitrogen and all of these heavier elements in solar systems probably at the 10 billion year mark. But we're even seeing evidence of oxygen in galaxies at 13.3 billion years ago. And so it really looks like the universe was concentrating and making heavier elements, the kinds of things that life would have required much, much earlier. Let's safely say 2 to 5 billion years before the solar system formed. So you've got quintillions, septillions of stars in the universe where life could have formed. And if the Earth is kind of normal, then life would have formed on those stars within a few 100 million years of the formation of that star. And so there should have been life forming on a huge percentage of the star systems here in the Milky Way. Tons of them qualify for that. So that is the argument. And we see here on Earth, the history of life. Life was pounded by volcanoes and asteroid impacts and who knows what other kinds of great calamities. Volcanoes that resurfaced the entire planet, snowball Earth, times when there was a thick layer of glacier even at the tropics of the planet, and yet life bounced back almost instantaneously. Once life gets established on a planet, it is almost impossible to wipe out. That, although we have not proven it, theoretically, life can transport from world to world. That you have a large asteroid impact, it strikes a planet, it kicks up debris into space. That debris drifts across the solar system, lands, enters the atmosphere of another planet, and that the life can survive that journey. It's this idea of panspermia. And you can even take this larger, that maybe life can travel from star system to star system on rocks that have been ejected out of star systems, that you would, over the course of billions of years, you would get this colonization of an entire galaxy just through natural processes. So that is the case for the universe that we find ourselves in, that not only life should be possible out there, but life should be literally everywhere. And when you consider what it's like to be on planet Earth, look around you. Now, I live in the middle of a Canadian rainforest, and so wherever I see trees, I see birds, I see bears, I see life. But no matter where you go on planet Earth, you go down to the bottom of a well that was drilled 5 kilometers below the surface of the Earth, you find life. You go to Antarctica, underneath the ice, you find life. You look in nuclear reactors. You look in high temperatures, low temperatures. You look up in the upper tops of the atmosphere. Wherever you go, life is everywhere. Life spreads. That you have a new volcanic island that appears in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and within a few 100,000 years, it is completely colonized by coconuts and spiders and things that can travel across the ocean, and seabirds and you name it, right? So life just fills every nook and cranny of every available ecological niche that we have. And so you would expect the same thing to happen to the universe. That, if there is evolution happening almost instantaneously on tens of millions, if not billions of worlds across the entire galaxy. And on those worlds, you got evolution, natural selection. You've got this process moving forward. Some percentage of them are going to have intelligent life. That intelligent life is going to want to explore the stars in the same way that we are. Not all of them, right? Probably not most of them, but some of them. That some fraction of those civilizations out there are going to want to explore the cosmos. And they would have started 5 billion years ago, 2 billion years ago, 3 billion years ago, that these civilizations would have reached the level of technological advancement that we're at, and then would have kept progressing beyond us. Imagine us with another 2 billion years of technological progress. What could we accomplish? Right? Right now, we can't send a robotic mission to another star system. Would we be able to do it in 1 million years? In 1 billion years? What would we be able to accomplish? Well, the laws of physics say you can kind of do a lot of really complicated and obvious things. You can do things like send out self-replicating robot probes that will go from star system to star system and replicate themselves, and then go to another star system and replicate themselves and go to another star system. That if we had, let's say 1% of the stars in the Milky Way had advanced civilizations who sent out robot probes, then there would be 1 billion civilizations who had sent out self-replicating robot probes. They would go from star system to star system, make copies of themselves. And you can fully explore an entire galaxy in about 10 million years. You just go 10% the speed of light. No, go 1% the speed of light. You can reach your entire galaxy in about 10 million years. So imagine 1 billion advanced civilizations within the Milky Way that are doing this. That the solar system should be just filled with self-replicating robot probes. There should be evidence of ancient factories on the surface of the moon, in the asteroid belt. They should be everywhere. They're drifting around, these old robot factories, long after the robots have come and gone and continue on to explore. We don't see any of that. That advanced civilizations could be building, larger and larger structures to access the energy from their star. We don't see that. That they would be communicating, sending out signals in various wavelengths, not just to communicate with themselves, but to communicate with each other. We don't see that. To communicate, to send messages to civilizations that are on the rise, like us. We don't see that. So from our perspective, the entire universe looks like a desert. Looks like not a desert island that is starting to have life, but literally nothing. It just looks like it's rocks and it's ice and it's stars as far as the eye can see. That there is no evidence in a universe that if life is as complicated and as big as it should be, life should be everywhere. But we see none of it. And, people always say, well, yeah, but we've barely started to look. We've gone to the ocean. We put in a thimbleful and we haven't found any whales. Well, imagine if whales came to you, which is what you would expect, that the whales would come and move into your house with you, right? That we would expect to see the explorers coming from other star systems. We see the rocks, right? Oumuamua, Atlas, Borisov. We see, rocks and ice making the journey from star system to star system, and yet we don't see the spacecraft. So philosophically, it has to tell us that life is a lot more rare than we thought. That it's not 1%. It's not, there aren't 1 billion civilizations in the Milky Way. There aren't 1 million civilizations. There aren't 1,000. There aren't 10. That all it takes is just one civilization to fully explore the entire galaxy, to clog every star system with the self-replicating robot probes, and we don't see any of it. And so the Fermi paradox says life should be everywhere, but we don't see any evidence of it, any obvious evidence of it. And so where is everybody? That, again, you get plopped down randomly to any place on Earth, and you're not going to have this argument with your friend. Wow, it's really hard for us to find any evidence of life. Life will be everywhere. Everywhere you look. Even if you're dropped into the harshest desert on Earth, you'll flip over rocks, you'll see spiders. You will see life. That if you look at the soil with a microscope, it will be teeming with life. But we don't see that evidence in the universe. It feels like the universe is empty, which is not what you would expect. And that is the paradox. And so, any flippant answer that people give about the paradox is insufficient, right? Well, maybe we just haven't started to look. No, we've looked, right? We've looked with a level of detail, both, we've looked at the moon and we don't see anything on the moon. We've listened for signals. We don't see any signals. We've scanned stars and we don't see anything weird that's happening. It looks like the universe is this empty wilderness. And that is the paradox. And it's weird and it should be unsettling because it's not what we should see. We should see life everywhere. It should feel like it's the Federation with ships coming and going. And that's not what we see. It should feel like the Borg are continuously gobbling up every star system within reach. And that's not what we see. King Tad, speaking of Vancouver Island threats, if the big one happens, are you in the tsunami zone or have enough elevation to not worry about it? Yeah, I have way too much elevation. So I live on the east coast of Vancouver Island, which is on the more protected side of the island. It's the west coast that faces the Pacific Ocean that is more at risk of tsunami. Where I live, we're on the sort of the protected side. So any waves will sort of crash around the outside of Vancouver Island. And if it's really bad, then they'll come up the Strait of Georgia. But then I live at about 200 meters altitude, so about 600 feet. So I'm well above any tsunami. And our house is very new. We have a really good building code in Canada. So, we know that the big one is coming. And so all new buildings have to be built with very good code. And a lot of the buildings built in Canada or built on the West Coast, it's all done with wood. Wood frame construction, and they handle earthquakes really well. It's brick buildings. Brick buildings are the worst because they just sort of obliterate in earthquakes. And we don't have, you're pretty much not allowed to build with brick buildings not allowed to build with brick in the west coast of Canada. And then there are older buildings that were built with brick, but they have to be completely rebuilt and reinforced. So I used to work in a building in Vancouver that had been retrofitted for earthquake preparedness, and it had this steel infrastructure that was embedded inside the building, and there was all these like steel cables and steel girders inside the building that would sort of act like a reinforcement for an earthquake. So we are aware, and like we get them a lot. My wife still hasn't experienced her first proper Canadian earthquake yet. But they are definitely unsettling when you're in one. And, I'm sure some of you out there have been through earthquakes, and they're scary. Although it is kind of funny. You're at this point now where you feel the earthquake and you're like, okay, this is fine. You hear the house going creak, 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 creak. You see everything shaking in the house, but it's not the bad kind. So then it's kind of fun, but we know that we're due for the big one. Melantoria, do you carry a rifle during bear season? Rifles are not very are not a good way to deal with bears. So bear spray is the best way. Even hunters will carry the bear spray to protect themselves from bears. They don't want to rely on their rifle. If you're a bear can move so fast, you have to be a crack shot to take out a bear that's charging you. So instead of just spraying in the general direction of where the bear is coming so that it hits a wave of pepper spray, that's your power move. Matthew, can you envision a technology that would allow us to view other planets in real time instead of as they were? No. I mean, the speed of light is the law, and there is nothing that we can develop, that would allow us to see in real time, because that would violate the speed of light. So we have to wait for events to happen and we have to wait for the light to reach us before we can see them. It would be amazing. Like, when you think about science fiction from Star Trek, Star Wars, but even science fiction books in the 1960s, when they first started to sort of think about some of these ideas, they would come up with a way to allow faster than light communication, because and that's essentially what you're arguing for, which is, could you flash a light that could be seen instantaneously? Then you could communicate. Now you're sending video signals back and forth to somebody, and that would be great that you could communicate in real time. Like, that would allow you to hold the empire together, as opposed to one side of your empire, your galactic empire, requiring signals to take 100,000 years to reach the other side of your galactic empire, and then another 100,000 years for the return signal to go back. Can you imagine? You want to send information. It takes 200,000 years for a return journey to send that information. That would suck. But that's just the reality. So no, unfortunately, we cannot communicate. We cannot observe without having to wait for the speed of light. Mosquito, could a great filter event be something... Sorry, Mosquito, could a great filter event be someone saying our species is too horrible to infect the whole galaxy and pushing a button? So, when people talk about the responses to the Fermi paradox, like, what are the answers to the Fermi paradox? The ones for me that are the most satisfying, not the ones that I like the best, but the ones that explain the paradox, is we're the only civilization in the universe. That, boom, done. That would explain the paradox, because we're the only civilization. And so the reason we don't see any other civilizations is because we are alone. Or we're first, so other civilizations are behind us, or other life forms. So just nobody's advanced as we are. Plus, they can be as advanced as we are. And then when you think about the speed of light, they could be 100,000 years ahead of us, but we've seen them 100,000 years in the past. So they appear to be at our level. But the third most plausible one, the one that neatly and tightly explains the entire Fermi paradox, is the zoo hypothesis, which is that we are in a cosmic zoo, that the universe that we see, the one that looks like a wilderness that contains no life, is actually a lie provided to us by some more advanced civilization that is purposefully changing our view of the cosmos. You can sort of imagine a version of this, like in Star Trek with the Prime Directive, or say in the Three Body Problem, where the Trisolarans are changing our view of the cosmos. There's another book called Spin, I think, where they sort of deal with that, or was it Earth? Anyway, so that seems a lot more fanciful, right? And you'd imagine the level of coordination that would be required for an advanced civilization to keep us clueless about the true nature of the Galactic Federation, but that would explain it. After that, the explanations for the Fermi paradox all have holes in them. Mike D, is it possible that advanced technological civilizations communicate in a way that we can't detect? Sure. There are the kinds of technologies that we are familiar with. And then there are technologies that we can imagine. So imagine communicating in gravitational waves or communicating with neutrinos. We can't do it, but we can imagine it. And then maybe there are ways of communicating using laws of physics that we just don't even understand. That is less likely. Like we understand at broad strokes the physics that underlie the universe. All right. Like, there will always be further nuance, and there will be more things that we didn't understand, and we'll get a better sense on it year after year after year. But just like in general, we know that there's stuff, and we know that there's energy. And that any other civilization that lives in the universe is going to be using stuff and using energy. And then they are going to give off their presence through, let's say, giving off waste heat, or how they go through the stuff that they have available to themselves. And that'll be the way that we will potentially detect them. And either they can intentionally try to communicate with us, which would be nice. Like, wouldn't that be great if you know, in the far, far future, we become super advanced and we think, well, let's make sure that we can communicate with other civilizations. Let's throw them a bone and send out some radio signals out into the cosmos just to give them a chance, give them a leg up. And we would hope that other civilizations would do that for us, that they're communicating largely with gravitational waves, but they still like leave the light on for the rest of us dummies to catch up to them. Dougal, how visible is the human race? Could we theoretically see evidence of our existence from a star light years away? Mostly no. So when you think about all of the capabilities that we have to be able to detect, I got a bug in here with me. All right. When you think about the technologies that we have to detect the presence of advanced civilizations out in the cosmos, we wouldn't be able to detect ourselves from even some of the closest stars. When you think about our ability to detect chlorofluorocarbons in the atmosphere of the Earth, or nuclear fallout from a nuclear war, or city lights, and so on. There's really two things that would give us away. One is the radio signals given off by our planet. And so right now, we would just barely be able to detect the presence of our air traffic control systems, which are very, very bright radio sources from, like, say, Proxima Centauri. When the square kilometer array comes online in the 2030s, that could detect our air traffic control system by, say, 100 when the square kilometer array comes online in the 2030s, that would be able to detect the presence of humanity's air traffic control system by about 100 light years away. But there was one thing that we did, or that we used to do with the Arecibo Observatory, which was that when astronomers would be mapping the features of asteroids, they would send out this really powerful radio pulse, and then they would measure how the radio pulse bounced off of the asteroid radar, right? And they use that to then scan and map the shape of these asteroids. And we have dozens of examples of asteroids where it's incredible. And when that radar pulse was sent out from Arecibo, it was very bright. And we would have been able to detect it from tens of thousands of light years away. If we were on the other end of that radio pulse, when Arecibo was scanning an asteroid, we would have seen it briefly, and then it would have gone away, right? And then we've gone like, wow! We would have, some alien would write on their, on their sheet of paper, wow, and put a little exclamation mark, right? That would be the wow signal. That's pretty much the brightest thing that humanity has ever done. But in the coming decades, we are going to get better and better at this. So we will develop the technology that will allow us to detect ourselves. But right now, we would be really hard pressed to detect ourselves. We don't have a telescope that could detect Earth orbiting around the sun. Not to mention being able to measure the atmosphere of the Earth. So we could not detect ourselves, even if we were around Alpha Centauri. Nunya, are there moonquakes or Marsquakes that are strong enough to cause issues with missions? Yes. So, yeah, I don't know about Mars. I mean, there are definitely Marsquakes, and NASA's, was it Phoenix? No. Polar Lander? Was it Polar Lander? No. Oh my God. Which was the Mars mission with the seismometer on it? Insight. Okay. So we know that there are Marsquakes on Mars. NASA's Mars Insight mission measured them, and some of them were fairly strong, like up to magnitude 5, I think. And Mars is although we don't see any active volcanic activity on the surface of Mars, we see the giant volcanoes, and we see some of the structures that we know that there were volcanoes on Mars in the past. And then the same thing on the moon. When the Apollo astronauts went to the moon, they put down a seismometer, and they were able to detect the presence of very faint moonquakes on the surface of the moon. So what impact? So like, it's very unlikely that it would cause any damage to any moon base or Mars base. But this is considered by mission planners. So we're down to about 11 spots. So we don't know where the Artemis 4 astronauts are going to be setting up on the surface of the moon. And we don't know where the future moon base is going to be. It's going to be in the south of the moon, near the permanently shadowed craters. And we've been reporting on Universe Today about the selection process for where these final locations are going to be. And that the mission planners are thinking about, how scientifically interesting are these places? How close are they to the permanently shadowed craters of the moon? Will they have access to energy? Is the terrain very flat? But one of the considerations is there a landslide risk? And that there are examples on the moon. You can actually see where there are boulders that have rolled downhill on the side of a crater. And that's because there was a moonquake, and that kicked off a boulder that rolled down the side of a crater on the moon. And you can imagine, if you were set up inside a crater on the moon, that there is a risk that a chunk of the side of the moon is going to be shaken loose. It's going to roll down and hit your base. So this is a thing that is considered. The risks are very low, but they're not zero. And so it's all about choosing where you set up your base. Domingo Flave. Okay. Domingo Flave. What phase of nature are you on at your timeline? Frogs out yet? Maybe blossoms in your garden? Mass deer destruction yet? So this is a thing that I've done for about 3 years now, which is that for every major event that happens here where I live, we call it a day. So there's like a frogs day, we have a first tulip day, and then although we don't check to see how it compares to previous years. So just to give you an example, April 12th is tulip day. So that's the first day that our tulips pop open, and they were a little early this year. And also it's the first day we see the sandhill cranes. So 1 year, sandhill cranes are these migratory cranes that go overhead in huge numbers. You can hear them all day long while they're going overhead. And so we set that date on the calendar, and that was also on the 12th. April 2nd was Daffodil Day. March 31st was when the swallows appear. And then the frog one is on the 15th of March. So all those have passed. So what's next? Mason bees. So at the end of April, we get our bees showing up. I think that's the last one that we have. Oh, and then we see our first dragonfly on May 11th. So we are through a lot of the various events, and I recommend you do this. So this was inspired by this idea, like in Japan, people will keep track of various seasons, and not just the 4 major seasons, but they'll actually have these sort of sub seasons that kind of map onto every couple of weeks. So you'll have your first cherry blossoms. You'll have, I don't know, the day the first leaves turn golden, whatever. And wherever you live in the world, there are these events that happen year after year after year, and you always sort of took them for granted. You never noticed, but write it down. The first time you're like, the flowers on our tree just blossomed. Great. Write that down. Write that date down in your calendar, and then have it send you a reminder every year when that event happens again. And you'll start to anticipate instead of waiting, I can't wait for summer. You're like, I can't wait for the first frost. I can't wait for the time when the ice is thick enough on the lake to be able to go skating or whatever, right? When I first see Orion in the sky, do that, and then you'll kind of break your year into these tinier seasons, and each one has this more meaningful memory for you. I recommend it. So the deer have not savaged my garden, but it's just a, it's going to happen. The fresh growth is just starting to happen on the fruit trees. I know the deer are just calculating what is the point where Fraser will experience the most misery, because that's how they feed, is they feed on sadness. $1,000. Is the nuclear reactor on the proposed new spacecraft a similar kind to what they want to use for a moon base? Yes. So like up until this point, all space missions, okay, this isn't a good way to describe. Okay, let me do this again. All right. So yes, sort of. So the idea, the problem with space, when you're traveling in space, when you build a base on the moon or wherever, is that you require power. You need lots and lots of power, electricity to heat yourself, to run all of the equipment that you use, and especially if you're going to do some kind of propulsion, you need power. There was an interview that I did, and the person I was talking to was saying like your top priorities are power, and power. Right? 1, 2, and 3 are power. And right now you can get power from solar, which is great, but you need a lot of solar panels to be able to give you any significant amount of power. And then if you're going to be traveling in the outer solar system, then they use these radioisotope thermoelectric generators, which is a decaying chunk of plutonium. And then you have the plutonium connected to a thermocouple. The heat turns into electricity, but not a lot. You get a couple of 100 watts out of what would be enough nuclear material to run a fission reactor. That would give you then hundreds of give you kilowatts, hundreds of kilowatts of power. And so the sort of one of the long-term ideas has been to send nuclear reactors to space. And, there are nuclear reactors in ships. The submarines and aircraft carriers have nuclear reactors on board. And actually, both the Americans and the Soviets built nuclear reactors that they tested in space. The Americans tested 2 of them, and the Soviets tested 31 nuclear reactors, fission reactors in space. And so the technology absolutely works. And yet, because people were very concerned about nuclear reactors for the longest time, worried about nuclear waste, things like that, the emphasis went away from nuclear reactors and onto other things like solar power or RTGs, which are kind of nuclear waste anyway. But anyway, but in the last, say, 10 years or so, NASA has been developing with the Department of Energy a new class of nuclear reactors. So one of the ones was called the kilopower, and this was to put a 100 kilowatt fission reactor onto, say, the moon. But this same kind of nuclear reactor could be used for spacecraft. And so there's kind of 2 ways you can use a nuclear reactor for spacecraft. One is with a nuclear rocket, with a fission rocket. So you run your nuclear reactor, it makes it very hot. You then expel some kind of propellant out the back of your spacecraft, like hydrogen, and you get a much higher specific impulse, higher thrust from your rocket than you would with a traditional chemical rocket. You can get just a lot more force. And if you watch, say, if you watch For All Mankind, they talk about nuclear rockets in that show. The other way is that you use the fission reactor to generate electricity, and then you use the electricity to run an ion engine, an electrodynamic thruster. So you are use the electricity to accelerate ions at the back of your spacecraft, and your spacecraft gets a kick in the opposite direction. There's a thing called the Hall effect thruster that's being tested at NASA. They've got much more powerful versions of the ion thrusters, the things that were on the Dawn mission, or even on all of the Starlinks. They all have ion engines. And so recently, well, I mean, NASA has been working on this technology, and there have been times when there's been some funding for this, and other times when people have tried to cut the funding to these space-based nuclear reactors. And now we're in this time where, it's all the rage again. And Jared Isaacman wants to do a mission to Mars, but testing one of these fission reactors, where they will pair up a fission reactor with an ion engine, carry multiple Mars helicopters to Mars, but also test out this whole technology stack. But for any future moon base, they're going to need one of these fission reactors, because you've got that 14 days of darkness, of cold that you've got to be able to get through. And a fission reactor provides you this base load power. The thing runs hot, provides a lot of heat, and can provide you with a lot of electricity that you can use to power your base. But the underlying technology is exactly the same as the fission reactors we have on submarines, on aircraft carriers, and various nuclear plants on Earth. Just different scales. And Morgan, Fraser, do you think if our solar system was in a void like Buddhist, do you think we would be inclined to invent telescopes to see the universe, or maybe we wouldn't? It's an interesting question. Our current crop of telescopes didn't get good enough. All right, let me do this again. So imagine that we found ourselves placed in these giant voids, things like the Bootes void. These are hundreds of millions of light years across, where they don't have large galactic structures inside of them, that they're sort of, they're a void. And then you have these walls around them where you do have larger clusters of galaxies. But it doesn't mean that there's no galaxies in them at all, just that there is a lower density of galaxies in there. So right now, when we look out into the universe, we can see some galaxies with the unaided eye. You can see Andromeda, you see Triangulum, you can see the Large and Small Magellanic Cloud without a telescope. You just look in the sky and you can see this sort of fuzzy bit. And so we would probably be inclined to try to see those things. And that there would be other stars that would be in the galaxy that we were in. But if there was no other stars, and it would be very hard to explain how you could get a solar system with the kind of metallicity that we have if you weren't part of a galaxy, because your star needs to form from the metals forged inside other stars that they were then given off of as they died. But let's just imagine that version where the sun forms in the center of one of these voids, and the solar system forms around it, and there's just no other stars in our vicinity. Would we detect? Would we have the incentive? Because we've only owned telescopes capable of seeing, that would have allowed us to see to the edges of the Bootes void if we happen to be in the middle of it. Probably not until the 1950s, right? That before that point, our telescopes were not good enough for us to detect those galaxies from those distances. And now, of course, we can use the Hubble Deep Field. You can see incredible things. So I think that we would have detected the cosmic microwave background radiation, right? That, maybe we wouldn't have realized that we wanted to look for stars, galaxies, but we would have known that there was something weird about the universe, that it wasn't perfectly the same in all directions. Would have detected this presence of radio signals. And when you think about, say, the detection of the cosmic microwave background radiation, that was detected in the 1960s. So our radio telescopes were good enough back in the 1960s to detect the presence of the cosmic microwave background radiation. Of course, the astronomers sort of had a sense, a hint that this is the kind of thing that they would have detected to explain the nature of the universe. And so, you know, once they detected it, then that explained what it is that they were looking for. And that would have sort of led us down this path of better and better radio telescopes. We would be scanning the sky with radio telescopes. We'd be scanning our star with radio telescopes, scanning other planets inside the solar system with radio telescopes. And eventually you would start to detect, say, fast radio bursts, other weird objects that are very, very bright, that are happening randomly across the sky. Gamma ray bursts, right? Like gamma ray bursts were discovered by space-based telescopes that were scanning the Earth looking for, you know, to enforce nuclear test bans, right? And so this telescope designed to watch the Earth detected the presence, or this satellite orbiting the Earth, watching for nuclear tests, detected the presence of gamma ray bursts, these events that were happening around the universe. So I think, you know, we wouldn't have begun with this cosmology understanding of the cosmos, but there would have been enough science that Earth was doing, that humanity was doing, that the bright things that the universe does, fast radio bursts, quasars, gamma ray bursts, pulsars, these things would have happened with enough regularity that we would have realized that there was more to the universe than we anticipated. And then we would build the tools that would close that gap between us and the galaxies at the very edge of what we can see. So eventually we would find it. Like, it would be delayed by a few decades, maybe a few centuries, but eventually we would figure it out. And you can sort of, you can adapt that question and say, well, like in the far, far future, after the galaxies have fallen over the cosmological horizon and there will be no evidence for the cosmic microwave background radiation, will future civilizations, will future astronomers develop a history of the cosmos? And chances are they will, that they will just build really powerful radio telescopes and they will detect the incredibly redshifted light from the cosmic microwave background radiation that, you know, that our curiosity knows no bounds. Matthew, do you believe Bob Lazar? No. You know, like I'm just waiting for somebody to do a peer-reviewed paper on any evidence. So, you know, it's not whether I believe or disbelieve. It's that I and the scientific community have been presented with insufficient evidence to form any kind of conclusion, right? So it's just, you know, nobody has put up anything that anybody can look at and consider and examine. So until that, we haven't even, the starting bell hasn't even gone off yet for us to be able to analyze this kind of evidence. And the fact that this has been going on for decades now makes me feel like no solid evidence will ever be provided, because it's sort of the same people keep stepping up and saying, you know, really it's going to happen this time. There's going to be congressional hearings. This time it's really good. And then no evidence is supplied. Like, remember, there was going to be disclosure, and then there was no disclosure. So it just, like, it hasn't met the minimum criteria for what it's going to take for us to be able to evaluate whether or not this stuff is real. It's just a bunch of stories right now. Dean Kovacs, what would happen if a primordial black hole passed inside the heliopause? I mean, it just depends on the size and mass of the black hole. You know, if it's a stellar mass black hole with several times the mass of the sun, primordial or not, then it would influence the orbits of the planets, and we would absolutely detect its presence. But if it was a lot smaller, say it was the orbit of, if it had the mass of a planet, that would be planet 9, right? Have the mass of planet Earth and it was out beyond the helios, we wouldn't even detect it. So it really just depends on the speed and the mass of the thing. Whether or not it is a black hole, it doesn't really matter. It just matters how much mass does it have. Wukalar Central. The size of the moon just happens to completely occlude the sun. I read a book that suggests this remarkable coincidence proves evidence for God. So there are plenty of coincidences here on Earth, and that is a good example of a coincidence, that the size of the moon is roughly the size of the sun, and so that we can get solar eclipses on the surface of the Earth. And that if the moon was a lot closer, then we would still get solar eclipses. We just wouldn't get annular eclipses. And if the moon was a lot smaller, then all the eclipses would be annular eclipses, where you would see the moon passing in front of the sun, but it wouldn't completely block it. That you have this sort of perfect, the moon is, 80 times closer, and the sun is 80 times bigger, and you end up with this perfect, what is it, 300, 400? 400. I forget the thing. Anyway, you can cut that out, Chad. But just think about the number of possible coincidences that there could have been in the solar system, right? That they just go on and on and on and on and on. That this is the perfect definition of a coincidence, right? Which is, you happen to be thinking about a friend and then they call you. What a coincidence, right? But think about all the times you thought about your friend and they didn't call you. Think about all the things. We only notice the occasional coincidence, and yet there's a ton of things that happen that we don't notice, or things that are just unrelated, or things that could be related that don't happen. And so when you think about the number of things that could happen here in the solar system that could be coincidences that aren't, we got one, right? And it's, right now it's sort of the time that we exist on this planet. We have this one, but imagine if we were here billions of years before, then the moon would be a lot bigger in the sky. Or farther in the future, then we would see something different. So, people always sort of describe the universe. They always sort of talk about how the universe is like perfectly designed for life, right? And the reality is that it's just not. That the universe is utterly inhospitable to life, except for this tiny little veneer on this one little planet in this backwards corner of this one galaxy supports life, and the rest of the universe is trying to kill us. Kirk Wagner, I'm late. What's everything I missed? I think you can go back to the beginning of the episode and play it at like triple speed. Arjun, is there any talk about making batteries that could be used to hold solar power that is collected during the lunar day? Yeah. So I've reported this in the past. The idea is a sand battery that you, a heat, what's it called? A heat transfer? Anyway, you run pipes into the regolith, and then you run heat. You run a fluid that you heat up with solar panels into the sand. And you heat up the sand and heat up the sand and heat up the regolith on the moon until it's like 400 Celsius. And then you can extract that heat during the lunar night, and use that to create electricity, and also to keep your base warm. And I think, I'm going off memory, but I think it was like you would need 3 cubic meters, maybe it was 5 cubic meters, like not a lot. Someone had done a paper that we had reported on Universe Today, that you would need like a sphere or a cube of regolith, just a few meters on a side, that you would run those pipes into, and then that would be enough to keep your base warm through the lunar night. That technology is being tested out here on Earth. Like I think in Finland they're building sand batteries, so they're pumping hot liquid into just sand, and then heating it up, and then they're extracting that heat again throughout the course of the winter, and it works, and it's like dead simple. And so that's the kind of technology that we want for the exploration of the moon. Something that is dead simple, doesn't require complicated electronics. You are just heating up the dirt under your feet, and then you're extracting that heat later on. Vistituti, we evolved on Earth at the exact time that it is habitable. Coincidence? Yeah, there you go. David Payton, if the universe is only 13.8 billion years old, where did all the heavy metals come from that are under our feet? So 13.8 billion years was enough time for the universe to get up to some shenanigans. So the process of creating heavier elements is called nucleosynthesis. And there have been a bunch of processes since the very beginning of the universe where this works. So the classic, the oldest one, is that at the very beginning of the universe, when the entire universe was in this hot, dense state, that the universe was like the core of a star. And hydrogen was fusing into helium for about 13 minutes early on in the universe. And then the universe had cooled down to the point that it was no longer high enough temperature for that nucleosynthesis to work. And that froze out the fractions of hydrogen to helium that we see today, about 75% hydrogen, 25% helium. And then you had stars form. And stars will sort of, as they die, the earliest stars were very big, and then they would die, explode as supernova, and that would seed heavier elements. And they would form heavier elements way up into gold, lead, all kinds of stuff. We also see heavier elements produced by stars, even stars like our sun, as they die. They puff off their outer layers. They are bleeding off oxygen, nitrogen, various chemicals into space that they formed when they were going through the process of nuclear fusion. And the sort of really exciting, kind of interesting discovery was made with the discovery of the kilonova in 2017, where we realized that colliding neutron stars, when they smash into each other, they form heavy elements and spread that out into the universe. That in the kilonova, they saw several times the Earth's mass in gold formed just in this moment, in this collision between two neutron stars. And we actually can now detect the presence of layers of material here on Earth formed by supernova. So there are these layers of iron that are found at the bottoms of the ocean where, a supernova went off in our vicinity, exploded, threw iron out into space. That iron made its way to Earth, got through the atmosphere, and collected in this layer around the entire planet. And we actually detect that. So you just have, generation after generation of stars living and dying, seeding the universe with heavier elements. There's that classic quote by Carl Sagan, and it's, like on the one hand, it's kind of corny, like you're made of stardust, right? But it is real. It's really true that, you are a bag of mostly water. The hydrogen is the primordial hydrogen that formed in the Big Bang. It has never been turned into anything more complicated than that. It has never been inside a star. It has never been inside the core of a star and turned into helium. It is just primordial hydrogen. And then the oxygen was formed inside a star, and that gave you the water. But then your body is made of carbon, right? Carbon formed in stars, nitrogen, sulfur, phosphorus, all of that was formed in stars. We are made of stardust. It's both a poetic idea and it is a scientifically valid idea. And in fact, you are made of colliding neutron stars, and it found its way to you, to make you. Your parents had nothing to do with it. It was all colliding neutron stars. 1,000 dots. Better question. Have you talked about Pluribus? Have I ever? In fact, I put Pluribus on my top 10 sci-fi television shows ever made. I added 2 shows to my top 10 sci-fi shows ever made this year, Pluribus and Alien Earth. Zach Curtis, aren't they trying to drop the term Big Bang? Not that I've heard. Who's trying to dropped the term the Big Bang. I mean, the term was originally proposed, what was it, by Fred Hoyle, I think, as a, like, it was a derogative term. He, like, oh, like the universe started with some kind of Big Bang. That's dummies. But it stuck. And so it's still used. No, Big Bang is still the way people describe the rapid expansion of the universe and the continuous expansion of the universe today. Whoa. Michael McConnell, do we know how big Io would be if it weren't so close to Jupiter that all of its water boiled off? That's an interesting question. So you look at Io. Let's look at the math here. So let's look at the orbital distances of the various moons of Jupiter. So the semi-major axis, Io is 421,700 kilometers. And Europa's semi-major axis is 670,900. So that's not very much difference between the two. And then Ganymede is at 1,000,000 kilometers and Callisto is at 1.8. So the difference between Io and Europa is only about 250,000 kilometers. And yet the results are dramatically different. Io is covered in lava and is molten rock, while Europa has this icy surface. So I don't know, but now I want to know the answer to this question. So I will, next time I talk to somebody who is fascinated with Io, I'll ask them that question. There's a person who I interview about Io from time to time, so I'll store that question. I like that. That's a great question though, because the tidal interactions between the moons of Jupiter, like, it's not just the gravity of Jupiter that's doing this, it's also the tidal interactions between the moons. Like, if you just had one moon, if it was just Io, then it wouldn't be molten. But it's because there's Europa and Callisto and Ganymede with it, that's what gets you the tidal flexing on the world. It's a great question. Yeah. Very cool. Hundreds of thousands. Smoke is saying hundreds of thousands of kilometers. Something's a little off in that scale. No. The semi-major axis, the distance from Io to the surface of Jupiter, would it be the center of Jupiter, is 421,000 kilometers. I mean, the distance from the Earth to the moon is 360 to 405,000 kilometers. So Io is at about the same distance from Jupiter as the moon is from the Earth. And then Europa is 670. But, like, obviously Jupiter has way more gravity. The closest moon to Jupiter is Métis at 128,000. And it is definitely a rock. But I wonder if it experiences any kind of tidal flexing. It is only 43 kilometers across. So anyway, we've reached the end of our episode. Thank you, everyone, for hanging out today. Thanks to the moderators. Thanks, Zapfan and R. Joan. And I think that's it. I really appreciate it. Thanks for hanging out. And thanks for everyone who asked those questions. I'm really glad to be back. Super fun. I hope that my semi-annual rant about the Fermi paradox, that's the one that'll stick for, that'll keep us all going for at least 6 months. Thanks in advance. Chad and Anton are gonna have to edit this nonsense together into some kind of cohesive thing. I've got an interview that I need to publish, and it's a really good one. So I'm going to, like, as soon as I'm done this conversation, I'm going to quickly go and publish the interview. It's all about the destruction of Phobos. So I think you're going to enjoy it. And then another interview on Wednesday, 2 QAs this week. Busy week. All right. Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you all next week.